This is the Daily Growth Discipleship Podcast. I'm Josh.
And I'm Chris. And today we're going to be talking to Chris Davis. Chris is a longtime friend and fellow CBC alum. Excited to talk to him. He's a youth pastor in Baltimore and a really great friend and someone I think we can learn a lot from in the way of living the discipleship lifestyle because this guy does it. You know, everything from a social media post to the way that he lives with his wife and his kids and what he's striving to do each and every single day in ministry. He emanates the love of Christ, and it really comes through when you get to talk to him and when you get to know him. So I'm really excited to talk to Chris today and see what we can learn about the discipleship lifestyle.
And in the first chapter of this conversation, we're going to be talking about Chris's story and how he became a Christian and what the Christian life looks like when you begin to follow Jesus. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me.
And Chris has been a longtime friend, like we mentioned earlier. Went to CBC with him. I like to always give kind of fun facts about guests sometimes. At CBC, Chris used to have a big afro.
It was massive.
And I had a really long, nasty goatee, and so if people wanted to distinguish between which Chris on campus, they would have to point to their head or the goatee to know which Chris they were talking about.
My wife's really quick to tell me that she's glad she met me after the afro. She's like, I don't think you would have got me with that thing. So, whatever that's worth.
My wife says the same thing about that nasty goatee I had. So
And we all made foolish mistakes in our youth.
That's right. That's what college is for.
That's right.
But Chris, you are from Flint, Michigan, right?
Yes, sir. Born and raised.
Born and raised. A proud Michigander.
Yep.
And, you have an interesting story growing up in Flint. I know, Flint's been in the news here recently with some stuff going on. It's a pretty rough town. In fact, I just saw Springfield, where we live, made the top 10 worst cities in America to live. We were number 8, and I think Flint was number 2, right?
I was, yeah.
With Detroit being number 1.
It's funny because I was born and raised in Flint, which was number 2. I saw Springfield shot up to number 8. And Baltimore's a pretty rough area where we are now, but Baltimore was number 9. So I joke around all the time when people say, Baltimore's like a vacation for me, and so it's like, this is easy. So
that's right.
That's funny.
And I'm from Memphis, and that was number 4. So at least, I guess this is better than that. But I actually don't think so. But anyway, we digress.
Yeah.
So growing up in Flint, I know Flint was a rough area, and we had a bunch of other students, friends, that also grew up in Flint, Michigan. And so I know you kind of come from a little bit of a rough background. I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that a little bit and tell us what your journey has been like coming to faith in Christ, because you didn't grow up a Christian, right?
So growing up in Flint, we grew up in an all-black community. We were the only white family in our entire church. For most of my life, we were the only white family in our school until I changed schools later on in high school. But within black culture, for the most part, a lot of people, you just go to church because that's what you do on a Sunday. So my mom would drag us to church all the time just because that's what you do. And so I went to church. I had some of those experiences early on and was but nothing ever really sank in. I didn't have faith. I would sleep on the back row of the church, and it was that kind of faith that I was brought up under. My mom was on fire, loved Jesus, but none of us kids ever really clicked or got it. And it took me much later in life until I was in high school before I found myself coming to Christ. And really the way it kind of played out for me is in a typical household for the area we grew up in. I didn't really have much of a relationship with my dad. He was in and out of jail, in and out of prison. He was absent because of drug addiction and various other things going on. Right now, I'm not 100% sure where he is. And so that's been kind of the relationship that we had with him, was in and out, in and out, in and out. And there's so many stories I could go into about that journey in and of itself. But because of the house that I grew up in, the arguing, my dad coming in and out, there were times we would come home from church and the house is completely empty because he pawned everything that we owned so he could go get high. And, just instances like that. What happened for me, though, just kind of growing up in that culture and in that atmosphere, you just become hard and your heart becomes hardened. And I think it's always ironic that Flint, is called what it is, because the people of Flint, a lot of them have such a hardened heart. And we know that Flint is like a stone, and it just kind of was fitting of that area. But so many people, you go through experiences that the experiences begin to shape who you become. And so for so long, I just felt like even at a young age, my heart was getting harder and harder and harder. I had this kid in high school named Nathan Murray. And this kid, he loved Jesus. He went to this church on the outskirts of Flint, and he bugged me every single week in high school. Like, would you go to church with me? Would you go to church? And I'm like, no, constantly shutting him down. And then all of a sudden one day, myself and my brother Kevin, we went to this party on a weekend, had no business being there. Bottom line, we were on the wrong side of town, hanging out with the wrong people. And, I ended up getting jumped pretty bad. There was about 7 guys that surrounded me and him, and, they gave it to us pretty good. And then I remember there was a guy that he stood up in the bed of his pickup truck, and then he took a shotgun and he pointed it in my face. And then he went to pull the trigger, and at the last second, the gun jammed. And at that moment, it just seemed like everything just froze, and I didn't really know what to do. And I think even they were surprised. And so I hit the gun out of my face, and I just took off running into this nearby cornfield. And I remember I just got as far back in there as I could, and I just fell to the ground, and I'm just weeping. And these guys they're in the truck driving through the field looking for me, and I'm just weeping. Like in that moment, I'm like, I know that was God. I know that God, saved me in that moment. And so the following week, I know here comes Nate Murray asking me, hey, you want to go to church? And this time I'm like, you know what, man, I think I do want to go this time. And but even still, when I started going to church with him, it wasn't an instantaneous thing. I was very skeptical. I will say the first week that we went, we were pretty late showing up to service, and the entrance was in the back. And so we come in the back door, worship is already going. And it was the first time I had ever experienced kids my age actively engaged in worship. And I felt the presence of God just like I did in that cornfield. I felt it in that sanctuary when I walked into that youth room. And in that moment, I'm like, okay, there's something here. And I wasn't fully ready to commit at that point. It was at least another 3 months before I made that decision to follow Jesus. But for me, it took having those experiences to actually feel the presence of God in order to say, okay, there's something here. Like this thing is real. And, that's really kind of what got me into the church in general and kind of really beginning to grow in my faith.
Yeah. Wow, man. What an incredible story. That's crazy. Not a lot of people, experience something that powerful. What was a big turning point for you, though? You said your heart had become hard, and obviously it took about that 3 or 4 month period to really kind of soften you up, and you recognized that something was going on. So what kind of led you to that? And maybe while you're thinking about it, because my story's kind of similar in that I walked away from the Lord. When I came back, I had an experience where I got introduced to a really strong Southern Pentecostal church, and I remember sitting in a prayer meeting and having that same experience of like the presence of God is here. Right. Like, this is incredible because, like you were saying, kids my age were praying incredibly, and it wasn't just kind of like they stand in a circle and kind of say like a mediocre prayer. Man, they were pursuing hard after God, and but same thing. I wasn't ready to commit yet either, and so. What was it that kind of led you to softening that heart up and saying, you know what, this really is something that I want to throw my lot in with and follow Christ?
You know what, man, for me, it was just kind of it was almost like a continual chiseling. Like each week that I went back, it was like a little piece of that stone was chipped away and chipped away and chipped away. And it was a long process. But the more that I saw that this thing was real, the students meant it. The youth pastor was a super genuine guy. As somebody that didn't have a father figure growing up, he kind of took me under his wing. He allowed me to do kind of an unofficial internship with him while I was still in high school. And even after I started going to the youth group, I messed up, made a lot of mistakes. And he really was the first person to take me under his side and say, hey, that's okay. Like, I'm going to help you work through these things. And so my relationship with him definitely helped kind of push through to realize the relational aspect of the faith rather than like the do's and don'ts that I witnessed in the church growing up. Mm-hmm. And so for me, like I said, it was each week. My youth pastor, he used to close every single sermon the same way. He was one of those guys that he would say, if you were to walk out of church right now today and you get hit by a bus, do you know where you're going, heaven or hell? And so, it was one of those things where I knew he was going to end the sermon like that each week. And each week I could just kind of feel this little tug, like, do you know? Like, do you really know? And finally, about 3 months in, I knew he was going to end the sermon that way. And before he even got the question out, I'm like jumping over rows of chairs to like run up to the front. I'm like, I want to go to heaven. And like, I want this thing. And so it's in that moment, like my heart it literally felt like my heart just broke. And, it's just a crazy softening. I even shared this story with our students last night in our youth group. I'm really pressing our students right now for the idea of you can't follow Jesus and stay the same. Mm-hmm. It's just impossible. Like if you're actually pursuing and following Jesus, pursuing what it means to be Christ-like, things in your life will change. Before church, my mom and I would argue all the time. I would steal money from her. A terrible relationship, primarily from my end. Like I did not make life easy on her. And, my room was a mess. I never did anything around the house. The night I got saved, the first thing I did when I got home was clean my room. Wow. And then I went out and I took the trash out, and I could see my mom like peeking around the corner. She's like, whose kid is this? And I'm like, and so I could see her like looking, and but I'm like, and I didn't even think about it at the time, but it literally like was in that moment that I responded to that pulling, that I felt like my character began to shift and began to change like right away. And so really, like I said, the turning point, like you asked to that point, it was just a gradual chipping away of that hardness. And then once I actually stepped out and responded to that, it's like the dam just broke open, and I just felt, the presence of God in a way like never before. Mm-hmm. Just this piece of, it's okay. The house I grew up in, part of what kept me from wanting to respond, especially during the 3-month window of time, was, if God is so good, why does my house look like this? Why are my parents arguing all the time? Why is my dad a drug addict? Why are all these things taking place? And those were the questions that I was wrestling with that kept me from responding for those 3 months. And in that moment, though, none of that mattered. The presence of God was so much more real than those circumstances that, I'm like, I got to give myself over to this. And I'm so glad that I did. But that was definitely the turning point. It was just a gentle, constant pursuit. And, once I responded, it all just went full blast from there.
Chris, thanks so much for telling us this first part of your story. It really is incredible how God leads us and guides us into salvation, just with the gentle promptings that we often take for granted. And what you observed with your mom in taking out the trash and things like that, it really is incredible how following Jesus really does begin to change you. Sometimes that happens imperceptibly slow, and we don't really feel like it's even happening. But that's part of what journaling's for. If you journal and you look back over the things that God's done in your life, it's easier to see the way that God's been working and moving in your life to make you more like Him. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Daily Growth Discipleship Podcast. Be sure to check out our next chapter in this conversation, where we talk about how God is a great father, and what that looked like for Chris Davis as he began to live his new life as a Christian. Be sure to leave us a review on iTunes or whatever other podcast app you choose to listen to this on, and let us know how we can do things better. We're always looking for constructive criticism and ways that we can grow daily.